Haram's latest victim appears to be the Nigerian presidential election. The February 14th presidential election, that's later this week, has been postponed by 6 weeks now because of security fears and will only take place on the 28th of March. Nigeria's security services say they need at least 6 weeks to launch a major offensive against Boko Haram to ensure safety during that election period. These elections are widely expected to be Nigeria's closest electoral contest yet, and economists and world leaders are keeping a close eye on Africa's biggest economy. Today, we take a look at Nigeria from a political as well as an economic angle. And joining us on the political front is political analyst Lisa Otto, who joins us in our studio in Pretoria. Very good morning to you. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
And then here in Johannesburg, we're joined by Dr. Martyn Davies, the CEO of Frontier Advisory, who will be taking a look at Nigeria's 2015 economic outlook. Very good morning to you too, Dr. Davies.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
If I can start with the politics, seeing that we've had these latest developments now very quickly. Lisa, if I can ask you just to give us your response to this election now being postponed in order for major offensives to be launched against Boko Haram. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that it's an issue that's been delayed. They've left it until the very week of the election, and there's already been some concerns around the National Electoral Commission's preparedness for this election. And having said that, I think we need to bear in mind that there has been a state of emergency in Nigeria with respect to Boko Haram for nearly 2 years now. And within that period, the country's forces have not been successful in being able to quell the group. And one is hard-pressed to believe that another 6 weeks will enable them to do that.
Do you think the likes of Chad and Cameroon are now going to step up their campaigns along with the Nigerian government to quell the northeast of the country?
Well, certainly bordering countries' forces have already been involved given the threat that has been in the border regions posed by Boko Haram. And of course, we've also learnt now that the African Union would like to send in troops, a force 7,500 men strong. Although analysts are suggesting that that will be insufficient in itself to deal with the group, even as an addition to Nigerian forces. And again, 6 weeks does not seem like a sufficient period of time within which to tackle this problem, given that Boko Haram seems to have stepped up its efforts since the beginning of the year. Several intelligence reports that the government had received prior to attacks have not been acted on. So I'm not really confident that this is going to render the kind of results that the government would suggest.
Let's come to the economic side of the ball, as it were, or the coin, as it were. How do you view this, and how's the economy going to view this postponement, and then the ground offensives and the like that's supposedly going to follow in the weeks to come?
Well, definitely, it's deeply problematic. This could not have come at a worse time. Already, we've seen that this year the Nigerian stock exchange is down 41%, the second worst performing in the world. Only Greece has performed worse this year, over the last 6 months at least, than what Nigeria has. The currency also is has lost over a third of its value. Only Ukraine has done worse. It was announced last week by the Nigerian government, because of significantly reduced oil prices, which account for approximately 95% of Nigeria's state revenue, or export revenue rather, that they're slashing capital expenditure for this year, 2015, by 90%. Where they should be cutting the cost of an extremely sizable, very corrupt government, rather, or public sector, rather they're cutting cost of essential infrastructure, is what Nigeria needs the most.
What does Nigeria then need, economically speaking, from this period and from the election itself going forward deep into 2015?
Well, again, there was argument, has this gone too far? Nigeria, and you talk about Chad, Niger, and neighboring countries, and this is, Nigeria is not so much a country as it is what I half-jokingly call an uncountry. It's the north, the Muslim north, which is largely under a state of emergency, as Lisa mentioned. It's a region that is largely anarchical. The South problems in the South were solved a few years ago, largely with buying off local politicians by the central government. I think the best case here, this is 6 weeks of continued market uncertainty. The best case for Nigeria, and this is not by any means a rosy case, but the best case is certainly a political change post-Goodluck Jonathan by the end of March. But do not assume the opposition are terribly that much better. It's a choice of the lesser of two evils through democratic process currently in Nigeria.
Lisa, if I can come to you and tap into that immediately. I want to talk about Goodluck Jonathan. It's going to be a very closely run thing, this election. How did you see the campaign that's gone on? He's even gone into the northeast once or twice, where he has very little support, it seems. How do you see this election? Is it going to be the end of Goodluck Jonathan, or do we see a future with Goodluck Jonathan very much in the picture?
Well, I think the election campaign has kind of avoided some of the bigger issues that one would consider to be important election issues, one of which has obviously been Boko Haram. One would expect that to be an issue that people are addressing for voters, but that's only really been brought up by the opposition. And President Goodluck Jonathan has left visiting these areas to kind of the very last moment within this kind of electoral period, knowing probably at that point that the elections were going to be postponed. There's a lot of contention around Goodluck Jonathan, whether he should have been allowed to stand for another term. And news reports coming from Nigeria suggest that at this stage, it's too close to call. It is going to be a very, very close election. And of course, we are kind of waiting with bated breath to see how the PDP, the ruling party, in an event of a loss at the polls, will respond to this, given that we've been in a democratic dispensation in Nigeria for the last 16 years. But prior to that, change of government tended to happen through military coups.
Is there a risk of the country being split even more along religious lines, north-south?
I think the country has always been split along religious lines. This has been a major factor in terms of the political culture of the country. And of course, we see that playing out in this election as well, because the APC candidate Buhari is a northerner, he is a Muslim. Whereas President Jonathan is a southerner and a Christian. So you already see those kind of dividing lines playing out there. And this is an important issue. Of course, in Nigeria, there is a kind of unofficial policy that should see presidents representing a kind of rotational system coming from different regions of the country, and also representing the various religions, obviously with it being a largely Christian-Muslim divide. So I think this is nothing new, but it's certainly a fault line that exists within the Nigerian political landscape.
Well, thank you very much for joining us live from Pretoria today, political analyst and an expert on Nigeria, Lisa Otto. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
If I can conclude with you, Dr. Davies, just if you were doing business, if you were one of the big companies, say South African business, doing business in Nigeria, how do you assess risk now? How do you look at, how do you plot your way forward in Nigeria now?
Well, you know, Nigeria is approaching 200 million people by 2050. It's forecast by the Economist magazine. Nigeria will have a bigger population than the United States. FMCG companies, consumer-facing enterprises, of course, this is the biggest country in Africa. This is a priority country for them. So think SABC Miller, think ShopRite, think Mr. Price. These are companies, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, MTN even. These are many of these countries' biggest markets, MTN particularly. Yeah. So, of course, it's an incredibly important market, despite all the political challenges, despite the internal instability, as Lisa mentioned, the religious fault line, you know, cutting the country literally almost in half. The capital will chase demographics regardless of a risk. I think something which is to mention on March 11th, we're hosting a Frontier Forum at the IDC, talking about the outlook of Nigeria, and exactly this, having leading South African companies to saying, well, what's next? Last year, the World Economic Forum in May, we were in Abuja. We hosted, well, it was the high point of Nigeria. Everyone was excited. Elections are coming. The country was, Boko Haram was on the rise once again. But things were saying we'll muster through. The tide has turned. Political change must take place. But regardless, I think, as I say, consumer-facing companies cannot ignore Nigeria, no matter what the risks and no matter how challenging that environment business is.
It's a question of navigating the tricky water and landscape that is Nigeria. Thank you, Dr. Davies, for joining us. That is the CEO of Frontier Advisory, Dr. Martyn Davies, join us live here in our studio in Johannesburg talking about Nigeria. How do you do business in Nigeria, of course, ahead of an election? Let's have a look at